Today, we're going to talk about how history gets written. And we're going to use the history of ancient India as our main example, because it's this incredible story that shows us something really important. History isn't just a set of facts, it's a story. And who tells that story and why they're telling it matters a lot.
So let's start with this big question. Do you think history is just a list of things that happened? Dates, names, events? Or is it more like an argument, a narrative that someone is building to prove a point? As we're about to see, when it comes to the history of ancient India, it has definitely been an argument.
Okay, so our story actually starts not in ancient India, but with the British in the 18th century. See, the whole modern study of India's ancient past didn't really kick off because of some pure academic curiosity. Nope, it started for a very practical reason. An empire needed to figure out how to rule the people it had just conquered.
And you can see just how systematic this was. Look at this timeline. It all kicks off in 1765. The East India Company takes over, and suddenly they have a problem. How do we apply local laws if we don't know what they are? So that leads directly to the translation of ancient texts like the Manu Smriti a decade later. Then they create institutions like the Asiatic Society to make it all official, to organize all this knowledge. This wasn't just a hobby, it was a decades-long project that all builds up to V.A. Smith's huge history book in 1904. They were literally building the intellectual rulebook for their empire.
So what kind of story did this brand new field of history tell? Well, it painted a very specific, and you could say a very convenient picture of ancient India. The narrative they built was that ancient Indians were these mystical, otherworldly people, totally obsessed with spirituality and the afterlife. But they had no real grasp of their own history, no sense of time. And crucially, they were just used to being ruled by all-powerful despots and had zero experience with things like nations or self-government.
And this quote from V.A. Smith, wow, it just lays it all out there, doesn't it? His book was the standard text for half a century, and he's flat out saying that the only form of government worth talking about in all of Indian history is autocracy, just one-man rule. There's no nuance here. It's a full stop.
And that gets us to the real point. This version of history wasn't just an academic exercise. It had a political job to do. I mean, think about it. If you believe Indians have only ever known absolute rulers and only care about the next world, then how on earth could they possibly govern themselves in this one? This narrative gave the British the perfect justification for their rule. It wasn't a conquest. It was a civilizing mission, a necessity.
But of course, that was not the end of the story. Not by a long shot. A new generation of Indian scholars, many of them trained in the very same Western methods, started to push back, to challenge this colonial story head-on. They were ready to reclaim their own past. These scholars were really on a mission. On one hand, they wanted to reform their own society. But just as important, they wanted to build a rock-solid historical case for self-government. And the way they did it was fascinating. They used the tools of Western historical research to basically dismantle the colonial version of their own history, piece by piece.
And one of the biggest shots fired in this historical battle was K.P. Jaiswal's 1924 book, Hindu Polity. I mean, this book was an absolute bombshell. It took direct aim at that core idea from V.A. Smith, that whole Indian despotism thing. Jaiswal dug into the same ancient sources and proved that actually republics, assemblies, and self-governing bodies were a real part of India's political tradition. It just completely blew a hole in the colonial argument. You can actually see this battle in the numbers. Take a look at this. V.A. Smith dedicated a full third of his book on ancient India to Alexander the Great's invasion. The focus is all on the foreign conqueror. But the nationalist historians, they completely flipped the script. They shifted the spotlight to indigenous Indian rulers, to people like Chandragupta Maurya who drove out the foreign forces. They were telling a whole new story, with a whole new set of heroes.
So after India gained independence, the whole debate started to change again. It wasn't just this simple back and forth between the colonial and nationalist views anymore. People started asking different kinds of questions, looking at the past in new ways that went way beyond just kings and politics.
A really big part of this shift came from scholars like A.L. Basham. His famous book, The Wonder That Was India, did something totally different. It wasn't trying to justify British rule or argue for Indian independence. It was a deep, really appreciative look at the culture, the society, what daily life was like in ancient India. The focus finally moved from the rulers to the people. And then you get this other game-changing approach from the historian D.D. Kasambi. He came at it from a completely different angle. Drawing on Marxist ideas, he basically said, look, if you want to understand a society, you have to start with its economy.
How did people make things? Who controlled the land and the trade? For Kasambi, everything else, culture, politics, religion, grew out of that economic base. So history was no longer a story about great men, it was a story about these deep, evolving economic and social forces. Okay, so all of that brings us pretty much to the present day. And guess what? The battle over India's past is still being fought, but the front lines have shifted. The arguments and the stakes are totally different now. This slide really lays out the change in stark terms. Back then, the fight was clearly political, right? You had colonial historians on one side justifying an empire, and nationalist historians on the other making a case for independence. But today, the source we're examining argues that the main fault line has moved. The conflict now is more ideological. It's between what's called a rational, evidence-based approach to history versus what's described as a communal one. So what does that communal approach actually look like? Well, according to our source material, it has a few key characteristics. It tends to define ancient India as being exclusively Hindu. It often treats myths and epic legends not as stories, but as literal factual history, even without archaeological or textual proof. It sometimes defends historical social structures like the caste system, and it draws sharp lines between groups, claiming some are originally indigenous, while labeling others, like Muslims and Christians, as foreigners.
So for many professional historians today, this is the new challenge. The fight isn't against a foreign colonial power anymore. It's a struggle to uphold the very methods of their profession, to defend reason, to defend evidence, and to defend scientific standards against a totally different way of thinking about what the past is and how we should study it. And that really brings us to the big takeaway. The story of how India's history has been written shows us, so clearly, that talking about the past is always about the present. The stories we tell ourselves about where we come from have a huge impact on where we think we should go. So the battle for the past has always been, and it still is, a battle for the future.